Hey, friends, welcome back to the Bible and Life podcast. This is Stephen Norris doing the intro this week. I'm John here, of course, the creator of the Bible and Life podcast and many other Bible teaching resources. And today, we're going to do something a tiny bit different and kind of try to wrap up this series we've been doing on discipleship by doing a little bit of a rapid fire Q&A, just kind of some hanging fruit that I feel like has been come up in our conversations outside of the podcast, that we are worth touching on, but not maybe spending, 20, 30 minutes on. How's that sound, John?
That sounds great. I think it'd be super helpful just to hit these last few things here on the podcast as we sort of wrap up this series on discipleship and disciple making. So I'll let you fire away and just kind of follow up question and explore however you see fit.
All right, great. So I've actually had this question from the very beginning, and I'd love to hear your take on this idea of praying without ceasing. Since we've been talking about discipleship and being with, this is the being with Jesus part of this conversation. Paul took it so far as to say, "Pray without ceasing." Praying is a way that we are with Christ. That's one of the ways that we do that. And for Paul to take it so far as to say to do it without stopping, um, obviously we can't close our eyes and stay in our closet and pray 24 hours a day. So how do you take that?
Yeah.
What do you interpret that to mean?
Yeah. No, that's good. And just for the reference for that, that's First Thessalonians 5:17, where Paul says, pray without ceasing. He says other things similar to that in other places. Colossians chapter 4, verse 2, I think it is. He says, devote yourselves to prayer, keeping alert in it. And so, Ephesians chapter 6, pray at all times in the Spirit with all kinds of prayers and petitions. So this idea of always praying, being devoted to prayer, praying without ceasing, does seem something that Paul wanted to make sure we get, right? So what does that mean? Since we have jobs we have to do and kids we have to take care of and yards we have to mow and laundry
Yeah,
that has to be done, and we have lots of other things we can do, so we can't be folding our hands and on our knees praying 24/7. So what does it mean to pray without ceasing? It's a good question, and I'm going to share with you just sort of a handful of random things since we're going kind of. And if there's anything you want to stop me on and say, wait, hold on that, you just feel free to interrupt. I first started thinking about this topic of praying without ceasing when I was 16 years old. So probably around 1985, 86, somewhere in there. Um, and I don't think I mentioned this earlier on. I may have, but I was handed this book by Brother Lawrence called The Practice of the Presence of God. Have you heard of that book?
yes, I actually have it on my shelf right next to me.
Okay. Well, Brother Lawrence was actually he never made it to full blown monkhood. So he was working in a monastery as the cook for the monks, but never quite actually became a monk.
Hmm.
And yet he's way more known than the other monks in the monastery where he was at because of this book called Practice the Presence of God. He didn't necessarily write the book. It is a collection of his letters as well as transcripts of conversations he had with several people while he was in the monastery about this very topic of praying without ceasing, because it became very apparent that even though he wasn't a full-blown monk, he somehow learned some things about praying without ceasing that the monks and other people needed to know.
Yeah.
So I was handed that book when I was 15, 16 years old, and read that book then, and it got me thinking about this whole idea of praying without ceasing from a very early age in my walk with Jesus. And what I learned is I'm not very good at it, just to be honest. it created trying to do what Brother Lawrence did created anxiety in me. It made me become, in some ways, self-absorbed and self-focused. So his approach, I think, is genuine and real, and was obviously very deep. And there's a lot to learn. In fact, I've had a lot of other people. I've recommended a lot of people read that book, but it didn't work super well for me. Probably because of the way I'm wired, probably some of my own brokenness and own background. Who knows? So, there's another guy by the name of Frank Laubach, who was a missionary in the Philippines in the 1940s and 50s, who wrote a book called Game with Minutes. And his idea was he wanted to see if he could have an intentional thought of God every minute of the day he was awake. Same sort of approach as Brother Lawrence.
Interesting.
Both those things, man, became very difficult for me. Very challenging. So I appreciate the goal and the trajectory of this idea of what they're aiming at is to be mindful of God through every waking moment of the day. I just am not very good at it. And I'm not 100% certain that's what Paul is talking about in 1 Thessalonians 5:17. I think what Paul is, in my opinion, I think what Paul is getting at there is that without ceasing might be better translated continually. So pray continually throughout the day, right? Pray, so that you have an ongoing conversation as you go about your day. That works for me. I can do that. That's natural, particularly in our day and age of soundbite conversations via texting and all that, where I'm having conversations with my wife or my daughter, and it's a text here and a text there. It's like I can do that same sort of thing with God. I can fire off a soundbite little text to God, or when I have a spare moment, I try to return my thought back to God and share with Him things I'm thinking about or things like that. And so that makes sense to me. This praying continues, having this ongoing conversation that starts from the moment I get up and continues until I go to bed at night. I think that's what Paul is getting at when he says, be devoted to prayer, pray continually, praying at all the time in the Spirit with all kinds of prayers and petitions. And I think that's what he's getting at. I think that's, at least for me, that makes sense. That's how I've tried to approach it. And some of that is specific requests. Some of that is thanking God for the strength to do things. Some of that is seeing maybe a beautiful sky or a beautiful sight and thanking God for the beauty of that. Some of that for me, honestly, is somewhat wordless, where I just will stop, slow down my breathing for a second. And even if it's just for 30 seconds to a minute, just to remember that God is my Father and that I am loved by Him. That's been really important for me. And so that's my approach to praying without ceasing and trying to just have a ongoing conversation with God throughout the day and be with Him in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Okay. Part of rapid fire is that it's a little bit of a hard shift every time you change topics. So,
Yeah.
More akin to our last episode talking about holiness, Christ-likeness, and our journey towards that. Do you have some practical ways that people can kind of actually chart that out? We were kind of talking about a chart.
Yeah.
Like actually measuring it so that it's a little less biased and a little more measurable.
Yeah. Not maybe
Got
so
any ideas
subjective.
on that?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I went a little long on the last one, so it wasn't very rapid fire. So maybe I'll try to be a little more brief on this one. But obviously, the ultimate goal of Christ likeness, if we're going to boil it down, the way Jesus boiled it down was to the two greatest commandments. So growing in your love for God, growing in your love for your neighbor, other people. That's the ultimate target, right? But even that's big, broad, and vague a little bit. So, and I've thought about this a lot as a pastor and a professor. How do we, at a Bible college, how do if you're going to graduate good Christ-like people, do we have metrics for that? We have metrics for a lot of other things at a college. Do we have metrics for that? In the church, do we have metrics? If we're going to say discipleship is the thing we're called to do we have metrics for that, right? I think the virtue lists in the New Testament can be used and ought to be used as metrics for that. So when you come to places like, say, Colossians chapter 3, 12 through 17, So then, my beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, and gentleness, bearing with one another and forgiving each other, just as God in Christ forgave you. And above all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. Those virtue lists like that, where you get these qualities, right?
Hmm.
So compassion, humility, gentleness, patience, forgiveness, love. If we take those kinds of virtue lists, they become sort of, oh, that's the metric. That's what I'm aiming for.
Hmm.
Um, and those are, I think that's the entire intent of those lists in the New Testament is they paint kind of a bulleted list of that's what we're looking at. You're as a disciple, you're trying to become like Jesus. Let me just tell you some of the things that's entailed in that. And so
Yeah.
I think the virtue list of the New Testament can become not only a target, but they become a measure. Okay, how am I doing on patience? How am I doing on forgiveness? How am I doing on joy? How am I doing on, right?
Hmm.
And then we can say, and we can ask God, show me which ones of these I need to grow in and what way I need to grow.
Yeah.
So,
Awesome. Well, I think that actually kind of leads pretty well into another one that I wanted to bring up, and that's in this whole discussion of discipleship, where do you see mentorship and community, um,
yeah,
fitting into this? How valuable do you think it is? And the way I think of this being a segue is, um, as you try to measure yourself against those virtues, very helpful, I think, to have someone outside of yourself help you look at that
yeah,
and discuss, how you're measuring up, rather than just being you and yourself, and
yeah.
maybe scoring yourself a little higher than it's honestly,
Yeah,
so
no, and both extremes I think are possible. We're either too easy on ourselves or we're too hard
sure,
on ourselves, right?
sure, yeah,
Depending on our temperament and our wiring and our background, right? And so I do think community becomes they can be a sounding board. They can help us, we all have blind spots, so they can help us see maybe, where you've really made progress here. And I've really seen this in you. I don't know if you've seen it in yourself, but I've noticed from where you used to be till now, right? That can be really helpful, as well as someone saying, "Hey, I've noticed the way you talk to your wife or the way you speak to your kids doesn't seem to be very gracious or gentle or kind." And remember, one of the things we're after, right? So having trusted community members who can share those things, that can be super helpful. So just on the measuring Christ likeness and that target, I think community is helpful. I also think that community is helpful in the sense of you just can't live out the virtues of Christ likeness solo by yourself, right? Like joy is
hmm
always experienced in community. Love is a relational component. Peace, I might experience that in my heart, but in the New Testament, it's typically also relational. There needs to be harmony and peace in relationships. Forgiveness obviously requires other people. So, um, the one another's of the New Testament uh, require our discipleship to be practiced in a relational context. Love one another, serve one another, bear one another's burdens. And so we we need each other both to help us grow. We need each other to demonstrate our growth. We need each other because God isn't in the business of collecting a whole bunch of individuals that he can just say, here we are. He's in the business of building a community that's full of the Spirit. And so community is really critical and central to our discipleship. A discipleship always happens through a life on life transfer. Always. There's always a relational component to it. So,
yeah,
so I think we need community. We didn't get to talk about mentors there, but I think that's another component of it that I think is important too. But
yeah, yeah, I think that's great.
but do you think we have time for me just to mention a couple things about mentorship, or should I
Sure,
hold it? Uh,
I think so.
yeah, let me just mention this. There's different kinds of mentors depending on where you're at. I want to put together a whole online course on how to disciple somebody and on mentorship someday, Lord willing. Maybe we'll get to that. But um, like one of the things that you and I spent time together or 5 years ago was, hey, I got two young girls at home. I would like to pick your brain on some parenting stuff.
Yep.
Right. And we spent some time intentionally talking about that. That was a very focused kind of mentorship.
Yep.
And so whenever I've mentored somebody, that's always been a question: is what do you hope to get out of it? What's your aim? So that it's not just all over the place, that it's targeted and focused. And so I've done it in different ways with different people. So I think we need mentors at different stages of life for different reasons and in different ways. You can have general spiritual mentors. You can have mentors for specific roles you play, like husband, wife, mother, father, employee, or whatever it is. So we need some of those individuals at various times in our life just to kind of help us maybe grow in some ways we wouldn't help without those one-on-one conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a quick summary, but I think that's pretty good. Okay, maybe one more, unless maybe maybe you can come back at this with a short list. Um, what are we've talked about numerous different ways of, you know, being a disciple, different tools we can use. Are there any others that we can use or that God can use on us
Yeah.
to help us in our growth towards being like Christ
Yeah. Yeah.
that we haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah. Because we've mentioned spiritual practices, we've mentioned mentors, we've mentioned other people in our life, right? So we've mentioned a handful of things. What are some other things that might be helpful to us being formed into Christ likeness?
Yeah.
Um, One is just this is one we don't often think of, but I think it's important. Is just the frustrations and irritations of everyday life is a tool that God can use to make us like Christ. I think of it like sandpaper, right? Rubbing
Hmm.
off the rough edges of our life, if we can be honest about that. And they can frustrations and irritations. One, they can point out certain things that are wrong with us. They can also be a cause for us to just pause and say, Lord, why does this kind of thing annoy me so much? What is going on in me that is so irritated by something seemingly so innocuous? So for example, for me, one of the things I've had to come to terms with is sometimes I've become aware of it enough that I can physically slow myself down. I can get in a big hurry. And then all of a sudden I get really annoyed with interruptions. I get really annoyed with slow drivers. I get really annoyed with slow people at the checkout at the store. And as I became aware of that over the course of my discipleship, it was like, oh, I just have a problem with being in a hurry, and I just want everything to go fast and be efficient. And uh, you know, and why is that? Right? Like, do I think I'm more important than other people? Right? Like, so I've I've learned that when I start feeling that kind of annoyance, I physically just need to say, I just need to slow myself down. I'm just going to physically slow my body down, physically slow down the pace at which I walk. Physically, I'm going to intentionally get in the slow lane to slow myself down. So the frustrations, annoyances, and irritations of life,
Yeah.
of just
That's
daily life, I think that's a tool God can use to make us aware of things going on in ourselves.
if we're willing to look at them as opportunities.
Yeah, if we're willing to look at them as opportunities, and a sandpaper to smooth off the rough edges. Uh,
Yeah.
Something closely related to that, but I think this is the big thing, is just the big trials of life. I don't think we should minimize the big trials of life as a tool God uses to train us and to teach us, right? Like, consider it all joy, my brother, when you encounter various trials. Why? Well, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance.
Mhm.
And so let an endurance have its perfect result in you, that you might be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Um,
Yeah.
so God believes that afflictions, difficulties, trials are beneficial for us. They're going to give us perseverance. They're going to form our character so that we can be mature and become like Jesus, lacking in nothing. All right, well, then I need to learn how to approach trials not as interruptions and impediments and as necessarily completely evil things, but as tools God wants to use for my formation. Um, Dallas
Yeah,
Willard
that
used to
was
talk about
not
the
as fun.
golden. What's that?
Yeah, so that's not as fun.
No, not as fun. Dallas Willard used to talk about the golden triangle. And in the golden triangle, you have the Holy Spirit, you have your spiritual practices, and you have trials. And God's Spirit will use your spiritual practices as well as the trials of life to help you become like Jesus.
Mm,
Um,
nice.
and I think you see that, James chapter 1, verse 2 through 4. You hear it in Romans chapter 5, where Paul talks similarly about similar themes as James does there about rejoicing in our trials, because they produce character. Character leads to perseverance. Perseverance leads to hope, and hope doesn't disappoint. Paul says. So
Hmm.
okay, well, there we go. We now know that what these God uses these trials to achieve these objectives in our life. It's going to produce character. It's going to produce endurance. Endurance is going to lead to hope, and hope is going to be satisfied when Jesus comes again and makes all things new. And so all of a sudden we realize this world isn't everything. It's not going to satisfy all my desires now. That's why there's going to be difficulties and disappointment and hurt, right? So now I can place my hope in a more secure thing, not this world, but in the things of the world to come, right? So the trials have useful benefits for us. So I think that's important for us to realize.
Yeah,
So trials is another thing God uses, I think, to help us become like Jesus.
yeah. Well, those are good ones. Well, those are the ones that I had for you. Unless you have anything else off the top of your head. Um,
No, I think this has been a
okay.
great conversation. Hopefully, it's been super helpful to people listening just to think through with us some of the challenges and issues and implications, some of the things involved in living intentionally as a disciple of Jesus. I think we've hit a lot of really important topics through this conversations.
I do too. There's tons more. It could be, you could go on and on and on.
Yeah.
Um, really, that's the goal of our whole life is to keep pursuing that mission and doing whatever we can and having those discussions to become more and more like Christ in our daily lives. But um, whatever we do next is gonna there's gonna be overlap.
Yep.
So
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Well, thanks, Stephen, for prompting some of these conversations. And thanks to all of you for tuning in and joining us in these conversations here on the Bible and Life. And thanks to those of you who make this ministry possible by your generous and prayerful support. If you want to join the team of supporters, you can do so by swinging over to johnwhitaker.net, clicking the Give button, and you can set up a one-time or recurring donation right there. And Stephen and I are looking forward to more conversations in the future, and so we look forward to talking with you again next week.